all you heroes, hawks, heralds, crows, pirates, and wardens. Welcome to the Dragon Age Lorecast, where we unpack, discuss, and galaxy brain about all the lore behind the Dragon Age series.
We are so excited to bring you this podcast. Every episode, we'll be talking about a different topic in the Dragon Age universe, from character deep dives to exalted marches and elven gods. We will cover it all.
There will be spoilers. And always remember, swooping is bad.
Hello and welcome to the Dragon Age Lorecast, where we talk about Dragon Age and its lore. My name is Austin, also known as Teacup, and I'm here with my lovely co-host.
I'm Shekup or Shelby, and I'm definitely keeping that blooper in the show, Austin.
Okay, awesome. Gonna confuse our listeners. They're gonna be like, "Wait, what? Oh, it's just Austin back on his bullshit."
What's new in life? I mean, you're always on
Right.
some kind of BS.
It's true. So we're back after our lovely patron chat to go back into our kind of deep dive into the Evanuris.
Yeah, I'm really excited to get back into it. We're actually kind of rounding out and coming into the last few. We do have one that's going to be a two-part episode coming up soon. I'm sure you can guess who that might be. But today we are talking about Falon'Din, who may be one of the more, could you say, unknown of the Evanuris?
Yeah, I know a very little about him other than like our very brief overview that we did way back when we first started the podcast. And I mean, I know about his brother because we visit one of his temples in Dragon Age Inquisition, but I don't know a lot about Falon'Din.
Yeah, well, the first thing to know about him is that it's Falon'Din. There is an N in there. But let's just dive right into the fun facts and get going. So, the first thing to know is that, interestingly enough, he is also associated with the owl as a symbol. And as you may know, if you listened to our Andriel episode, Andriel also is associated with the owl as a symbol. So we kind of have the owl doing double duty here. I don't know if, maybe back in the day of Arlathon and Elvenon, the owl, it kind of was different types of owls, different species of owls for each of them. We don't really know. We just know that the owl was a symbol of both of them. But let's get into the next fun fact, which is something that's going to come back. And there is an interesting statue, and I think the Emerald Graves, and it is of a man who has really long hair. This hair, suspiciously, covers his ears, so we can't verify if he's an elf or a human, but the man is like sternly pointing at an unknown subject, and it's often thought in lore that the statue is of Falon'Din, though we don't know why it was built. We don't know what the meaning of it is, and we don't really even have any confirmation that it is indeed of Falon'Din. However, we do have a few more statues of him, which we'll get into a little bit later. Now, another interesting thing is that you can find a unique longbow in Dragon Age Origins named Falon'Din's Reach. It can be found in the Dragon's Hoard in the Brazilian ruins. What's interesting to me is that this is named Falon'Din's Reach when we just spoke of a statue talking about Falon'Din reaching and pointing out into the abyss. It's just an interesting connection. And then lastly, but certainly not least, is that Falon'Din is said to be the oldest child of Mythal and Elgar'nan, followed shortly thereafter with Dirthaman.
A lot of interesting things. I don't have a lot about thoughts about the fun facts other than they are fun and interesting. There's nothing that like puts up and like, oh, this is a great fan theory, but I'm excited to get into it. Mainly because I know what Falon'Din's domain is, which is related to death, and I find gods of the dead very interesting. So
Yeah, you do. I will say, as a player in several of your DM campaigns, you do have a tendency to bring in gods of death. So, speaking of that, let's just dive right in. So, we've already come out and said it. Falon'Din is the god of death in the Dragon Age elven lore universe. However, that's not all he is. He's also the god of the dead. And I think that those are two separate things. Once again, we have multiple domains associated with one god, because you can be the god of death, the god of dying, like the Grim Reaper, so to speak. But I do think that that is a little bit distinct, related, of course, from being the god of the dead. Like, there's just a little bit of a difference there. I don't know
right.
what you think.
Well, the Greeks definitely noticed a difference because Hades is god of the underworld and of the dead. Thanatos is god of death. And so he like guards in some of the mythology, he like guards the gates of death to make sure that the dead stay dead. And so it's interesting that like Hades obviously is the overarching thing, but there is a separate embodiment for the god of death versus dead.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in addition to those two things, he is also the one that is said to guide the dead to the beyond, which is beyond the fade. It's kind of like the afterlife in this universe. Um, so, those are kind of the three things he oversees. He oversees death, he oversees the dead, and he oversees the process of transporting a person's soul or an elf's soul from the real world of Thedas to the beyond. Those are three important things. However, there's more. He's also said to be the god of fortune. We're not really sure why. We don't have a ton of info on that one. But in addition to that, he's also said to be a master scryer. So he kind of, and if you don't know what scrying is, it's basically like not quite seeing the future, but it's like seeing into other people's lives and seeing what's happening right then and there, seeing what people are doing, kind of not invading people's lives, but like being able to know what a person is doing. Think omniscience, if you will.
Yeah. Or if you are like us, fans of the inheritance cycle, when they scry something, you can only scry what you have seen or things you know, which is a limitation. But you're scrying typically the presence and the present, not presence, present versus like there's a lot of discussion of like, no, you can't scry the past and you can't scry the future.
Right. That would be a different spell. And I think does the act of scrying come from D&D, or is it maybe something older than that? I don't know if you know off the top of your head.
It's definitely older because it is just in general forms of it's a form of magic that is present in a lot of mythologies. And though it is prevalent in D&D and it functions in a similar way of like you are looking at the present. The D&D description of the scrying spell is a good description of that, but I'm not going to read that. You can look that up.
We don't need to get too far into it. But anyway, so Falon'Din is said to be a master scryer, which we will double check on that, I think, in a few minutes. But let's get into his names. So I know that like in the past couple weeks, we've had some Evanurus that are just like one or two names and that's it. So we've had a break from the ones who have multiple, but it's just really interesting to me that of the Evanurus that have these multiple names, and like abundant names, like 4, 5, 6 names, they're the ones that are closest to Elgrennon and Mythal, who also have a ton of names associated with them. Falon'Din has 4, whereas Siles and June, who we talked about, I think in June's episode with Katie, like they're very much like the outcasts of the Evenurus. They're the in-laws, and they have 1 or 2 names. So it's just another interesting dichotomy between the kind of 2 groups of the Evenurus. So, some of Falon'Din's names, these are Friend of the Dead, the Guide, the Merciful One, and then lastly, we have another one called Lethanavir, which I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, but if you know if you know that I am pronouncing it incorrectly, please let me know. So you may be interested in this last name. You may be like, Shelby, I don't know what that means. You said that like I'm supposed to know what it means. But let me tell you, because I also had never heard this before. So I had to do some major researching into this one. So according to the Elven Prayer for the Dead item description, this item is a gift item from Dragon Age Origins Awakening for Vallana specifically. Lethanavir's translation is friend to the dead. So Fen'Harel on Tumblr argues that this is more of a poetic translation and that a more literal translation might be kin of death or even kin of the inevitable way, as death is inevitable. Whereas the translation of Falon'Din would be the actual literal translation of Friend of the Dead. Lethanavir is simultaneously a poetic way to say that, as well as both a title and, as we've mentioned, a poetic interpretation. Now, as a reminder, Fen'Harel is the one that does the Elven translations over on Tumblr. Great blog. Go check her out. But it's just really an interesting situation here where we have something that is so obscure in the lore going back to a DLC from the first game that we're now mentioning about Falon'Din later on. So it's just interesting to me. Do you have thoughts? You look like you're furiously Googling something.
The word reminds me so much of an Elvish word from Tolkien's world, Mithrandir, which is one of Gandalf's titles, which I think means something similar to like friend, or maybe it is Grey Wanderer or something like that, but I can't remember exactly.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting to me, the thing that it means the Grey Pilgrim, the Grey Wanderer.
Mithrandir means the Grey Pilgrim.
And so what's interesting to me is the one kind of the inevitable way, talking about death, but I think it's also interesting and a point to bring out that we've had 2 other gods or Evenurus who have ways associated with them. Like, I believe it was Siles who had the way of peace, and then Andriel had like the way of the arrow or the way of the 3 trees or something, or the path of the 3 trees.
And I think there's another one too, but yeah, you're absolutely right.
Right. And so I just think that's interesting. The inevitable kin of the inevitable way. Like, I think there is something that we can see here among the Evenurus to their followers of like, it's not just worshiping them, but like committing to a particular idealistic lifestyle. Like, maybe you're not always achieving this lifestyle, but this is the ideal that these followers strive for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I absolutely agree with that. And there absolutely is the possibility in lore, both from a cynical perspective of us outside thinking about the developers, right? Like, there's the possibility that they add in more ways for different Evenurus who don't have one later on, right? And also in lore, if we're looking at it from an in-universe perspective, there's absolutely also the possibility that the ways of these other elven gods may have been lost over time.
Yes, but I like the idea of like these gods having these disciplines, but then the god of death being like, well, I'm the kin of the inevitable way because this is where you all end up. death is unavoidable. But it's interesting to me, and another thing that it's interesting, a group of people who used to have like really long lifespans, and like how that colors a creation of a god of death versus, in humanity, if we really want to talk about it, like relatively short lifespans in the grand scheme of time.
Yeah. And I also think it's important to remember that, like, I think that Falon'Din and Fen'Harel have a lot in common, because if you think about your point, Uthenera is not something that all elves get to achieve. Uthenera is something that the wealthy elves get to achieve because they have the money to make sure that their bodies are cared for. They have the money to pay for a tomb. They have the money to rent that space out for time immemorial. Elven slaves don't have the money, financial status, anything like that to do that. And so I think that there is a lot of crossover here with Falon'Din and Fen'Harel, because when you think about death, Falon'Din is going to be there's just a more likelihood statistically that he is going to be transporting more elves who are poor, elves who do not have status and class and wealth into the beyond, because they're going to be dying more than the wealthy elves who have entered into Uthenera. And so, as we know, Solas, Fen'Harel, is also concerned with these lower class elves. And so I think that there is definitely some crossover and potential there for them to have a little bit of commonality.
I agree, which makes what I'm assuming is going to come up later, and we'll get to, but like Solas's comments on Falon'Din all the more interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll get there. So, okay, let's talk about the constellation real quick. So, the constellation Tenebrium or Tenebrium is associated with Falon'Din. This constellation, again, is said to depict an owl who, among Thedosian society, is often nicknamed as Shadow. Interestingly enough, it's also thought that this constellation may also be associated with the old god of night, Lusakon. The Codex argues, however, that the Falon'Din association is an older one, since this constellation has never, it said never, been interpreted as a dragon. So this is one where a lot of times in the Codex entries for the other Evanuris or for the other constellations, they always say something like, this may have been associated with the Evanuris, or elves claim that this was associated with this member of the Evanuris, but everyone else denies that. However, with this one, interestingly enough, it's like, oh no, this one's probably legit. So that's another instance of Falon'Din being a little bit different from the rest of the Evanuris. And I think that that's something important to highlight.
Right. It could just be a simple point of no one catching like a consistency among Codex writing, because we do know that there are like multiple writers to Codex.
Yes, there is absolutely that. But yeah, we just don't know.
It is interesting. I just wanted to note that I could have told you that by its name alone that it would have been associated with some type of god of death, because it is directly like derived from the Latin word for darkness,
which is tenebris, right?
Yeah, tenebris or tenebrae.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. Okay, so let's get into temples, statues, all that kind of fun stuff, where shrines to Falon'Din are located. So we know that he did have a temple, but we don't know, or at least we don't know yet, where it was or is. However, he has a ton of depictions in statues. More than any other elven god, we have multiple depictions of Falon'Din throughout multiple games. Typically, this occurs via statues. He has actually even been depicted in a couple different positions as the man pointing, which we mentioned earlier, and as an owl, and there are others as well. So some of the ones we know of for sure is we have a statue of Falon'Din in the Elven ruins in Origins. We have a statue of Falon'Din pointing sternly in the Emerald Graves, which we mentioned in the fun facts. We have a statue of Falon'Din pointing sternly in the Fade. And we have a statue of an owl named the Guide of Falon'Din in Crestwood.
He likes to point.
He does, and I think it's such an interesting marker or identifier. I'm not really sure what the right word is to use, but it's like, to me, it's just curious, because you would think, at least I would think, that like a pointing statue would be like the elven god of knowledge, like a professor type, a teacher type, even the mother type, like Mythal or Siles.
Mhm.
But instead, we have it associated with the god of death. And so to me, it takes on a much more of an effect of almost like Falon'Din cursing you, like you're up next. You know what I mean?
Right. It gives very much like, if y'all remember from the Ahsoka show, when we see those big statues of the ones or like the Mortis gods, and the father is like sternly pointing, like that's what I imagine. Like I associate like with this like sternly pointing on this thing of like judgment, of standing in like accusation of this, which is sometimes associated with gods of death because they often are also judges, like Osiris and Anubis being judges of the dead as well in Egyptian mythology. Like it is interesting, but like Falon'Din, he doesn't necessarily, I know we're going to get into this a little bit, but he doesn't necessarily judge the dead. That's not really his role.
Yeah, it's just, again, this is a mix mash of lore, and these are the questions we're finding. But let's move on to his Valisline. So, the simple version of Falon'Din's Valisline basically looks like a tree trunk in between the eyes, and then the branches extend onto the forehead, and the roots go down the nose and around the mouth and chin. The complex version builds onto this, adding branches and roots throughout the rest of the face. Which I think is also interesting because he's not really associated with nature like at all. But this is very nature-esque, in my opinion.
Right. It's also like interesting that like some of the Valisline are like viney and like almost flowery, but not really flowery, but like it's less like tree branches, it's more like vines and stuff like that, leaf kind of stuff. But like Falon'Din gets this branches kind of thing, which is interesting because like trees in various mythology signify, sometimes they signify knowledge, they signify like a connection to the like basic, or the fancy theological word is like the primordial, the very like basic, the foundational stuff that is around us. Like, you know, Yggdrasil is the world tree, it is the foundation of the 9 realms, it connects everything. So here we get this, but this is a god of something that is inescapable. Like death happens, death comes for us all. And it's also this very, like in most mythology, like the god of death and dead is so important because it's such a, it's functional to how the world works. Everything dies. Everything is born, created, and everything dies.
It's integral to the universe. So let's get into Falon'Din's reputation among the Evenurus. And this is interesting, fascinating to me, because there are a lot of different things he's known for. And he does actually have a few notable relationships among the Evenurus to mention. So I think the first one, and you can probably guess, is his relationship with his twin, Dirthamin. Most notably, definitely. They were seen as twin souls. And in the lore, it's actually again, fascinating because there is a discrepancy, there's a disagreement in the lore and universe because a lot of people, most people, I think, believed that they were actually twins, actually birthed of Mythal and Elgranon, while others say they actually had no blood relation at all and their souls were just twins, but they were not in blood relation. And the oldest elven stories from the time of Elvenon, like going back all the way, never mention them separately. So there have been many times in the lore so far this season where we've said, oh, actually, like this is newer, or this wasn't mentioned in the oldest stories, like with June, perhaps. However, this time, this is one where we can explicitly say Falon'Din and Dirthamin have always been associated with one another. So I think that's interesting because it leads to my next point, which is that we always see them referred to as mirrors of one another, maybe even foils in some situations. So what's interesting in terms of their names is that in the earliest times of Elvenon and Arlathon, Falon'Din was known as Dirthamin's shadow, and Dirthamin was known as Falon'Din's reflection. So they actually kind of switch names over the course of time, which is so interesting. But we don't really know why they've always been associated with one another. We don't know what makes them specifically so similar. We just know that they've always been associated with each other. And we do have a little bit of a childhood story, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So in addition to Dirthamin, we do have more. We have a tale about Falon'Din arguing with Elgranon. And their argument was so potent, so fierce, that Mythal finally had to step in. And she suggested that instead of Falon'Din and Elgranon continuing to fight one another themselves, they should instead send a knight in their stead to fight one another. And so they do listen to Mythal, and that's a good thing because the lore suggests and implies that this argument probably would have led to a civil war among the Evenurus. In the end, Falon'Din's knight did lose to Elgranon's, so Elgranon wins this battle. But Solas goes on to continue, Solas goes on to claim that Falon'Din's vanity, even though he lost, his vanity was immense. It was so great. So much was his desire to have followers, to amass worshipers, to be seen as like the pinnacle of elven piety and worship, that he started endless wars basically to gain more and more followers. And you might be thinking, well, if he's killing people, why is he getting more followers? You have to remember, because he's the god of death. So the more people die, the more people follow him, as is just natural. So in this, Falon'Din basically would kill everyone who refused to bow to him. And it's only when Mythal and the other Evenurus finally rally together and attack him in his temple that he finally surrendered. I did bring a quote from Solas in when you ask him about, the elven gods or whatever, about this same situation. And so this is what Solas says. I do not believe they sing songs about Falon'Din's vanity. It is said Falon'Din's appetite for adulation was so great that he began wars to amass more worshippers. The blood of those who wouldn't bow low filled lakes as wide as oceans. Mythal rallied the gods once in the shadow of Falon'Din's hunger stretched across her own people. It was almost too late. Falon'Din only surrendered when his brethren bloodied him in his own temple. Do you have thoughts about this?
So this is really interesting because, and I don't know if this is an actual mythology or not, but like one of the points and like the big like plot twist in the Lightning Thief, the Percy Jackson series, is that Hades stole the Master Bolt, blamed Poseidon so that he could start a war that would gain him more power. In reality, it's not Hades who is doing this. It's Kronos who has stolen the Master Bolt because he's trying to get the Olympians to fight themselves. And so I'm curious, like, what is like the half truth that Solas is mentioning here, because we do have to acknowledge that his writer has says that he does not directly lie. Solas never directly lies. But what is the half truth? And like, I think a quote from Solas himself is a point of like how he dances in these half truths, which is when he talks about the siege of Ostagar, and he talks about in one say, I see, the jealous Logain like vying for power or whatever, and in the other thing, I see a cautious general who's not willing to lose any more men on a boy king's wish of glory or something like that. Like, and like, is this Solas's interpretation? Was Falon'Din set up? Could Solas have set this up and presented in some way? Like, just because Solas says this is what's happened doesn't mean that that's the full truth that we're getting. There might have been a point where there was thought that Falon'Din was going to kill a bunch of followers and gain power, and the Evaners did come up and beat him up. But the reasoning for why that might be where we're getting this half-truth.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to throw out, and we don't really know. I think there are a lot of different ways this could be taken. This could have started as an Evanirus civil war, and others abandoned him, and then they all attacked him. It could be not this intense at all, and Falon'Din is just trying to like save the people. Who knows? I think there are lots of different ways that it could go in regards to Solas maybe not telling the whole truth. But regardless of that, I think that it establishes an important personality point for Falon'Din, because there's no way that he would do any of this without being vain at some level. So we can say Falon'Din's vanity was great, regardless of whether or not Solas is misrepresenting part of this one story. So we've established that he has some significant relationships with Dirthaman, Elgar'nan, Mythal, and Fen'Harel even. So that's important to note. But we also have a few songs that are ascribed to him, and we'll talk about this, and then we'll go to our mid-break. So the first one comes from the Codex, appropriately, Song to Falon'Din, and it says this. The people swore their lives to Falon'Din, who mastered the dark that lies, whose shadows hunger, whose faithful sing, whose wings of death surround him, thick as night. Lethanavir, master scryer, be our guide, through shapeless worlds and airless skies, end quote. And that comes from that codex, and you can find it in the Temple of Mythal. So do you have thoughts about this first song in particular? Does any part of it stand out to you?
The part that stood out to me in this song was who mastered the darkness that lies. And I am immediately called to here lies the abyss, the well of all souls. From these emerald waters doth life begin anew. Come to me, child, I shall embrace you. In my arms lies eternity, which is from the Canticle of Andraste.
That's what I thought of too.
And so, but it's interesting, the dark that lies, and there's a lot of comparisons in that here lies the abyss kind of section of the Canticle of Andraste. But I think it's interesting that in this song, the people swore their lives to Falon'Din, who mastered the dark that lies, and then here lies the abyss, which we tend to think of an abyss as a bottomless cavern that is surrounded in darkness. And so, but in Andraste's version, it's all associated with life. Like, here's where life begins anew, and here we are with like this very like dark kind of stuff, like guiding to the death, which we know because of that's where he is. I think this intends like there's probably a connection, kind of a yin yang kind of life and death are two sides of the same coin here. That's probably being emphasized in the lore, but I found that very interesting.
Yes, me too. Okay, so on to the next one, which is actually the last one. So the first one was from the Song to Falon'Din Codex, and this one is from the Falon'Din Codex, the general one. So it begins actually with this. O Falon'Din, Lethanavir, friend to the dead, guide my feet calm my soul, lead me to my rest. And so the thing I find interesting is truly just the difference between these two songs. Like this one is so peaceful, it's so serene, it's like mystical almost, like I'm ready, it's my time, let me go. Whereas the other one is almost warlike. It's very spy, it's very Assassin's Creed almost, like could fit into that universe too. And so it's just very interesting to me, the difference.
I totally agree in this. And it's interesting to me because to me, when I read these, who I feel like these are written by someone who is dying before they're ready versus someone who has accepted the reality of death. That it's an escape. Like there are two views of how we as mortals, as humans, view death, that deal with the idea that we're going to be finite. Like there's a lot of fear associated with that. But on a lot of ways, like especially if you're talking to someone who has, is older and I'm talking like 90s, like late 80s, 90s, all that kind of stuff. They talk about like death is something that they deal with, and that there's an acceptance of that, of like, I'm not afraid of this because I know it's coming and there's nothing I can do to stop this. But I hope that so I'm going to have as much peace in this process as I possibly can.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, that these two are coming from people who have different reactions and feelings on their deaths. Absolutely love it. Completely agree. No notes. So on that note, let's go to the mid-break.
Yeah.
So you like to read? What's wrong with that?
It's frivolous. There are more important things for me to do.
That's just her favorite.
Nobody asked you, Tevinter.
I couldn't finish the last one you lent me. I actually feel dumber for having tried.
It's literature. Smutty literature. Whatever you do, don't tell Varric.
No offense, but might I try? I've got a quick hand, after all. Let's see. Oh, when was the last time I slipped my hand into some dark hole? I remember. Long story, that.
You hurt my head sometimes, Solas.
Yes. I have been known to do that.
So welcome to the middle of the show where we take time to thank our patrons. Thank you to all of our patrons. Thank you to our first patrons, Genesis and Lisa M. We also have a new patron, or a returning patron, in Acalia. Is that how I'm going to say that? Welcome back. And then Julian C., welcome to our Patreon. Also, if you want to join our Patreon, you can do so at patreon.com/DALorecast. If you can't do that, that's okay. A great way to support us is to leave us ratings and reviews. And if you leave us 5 stars and some kind words, we'll read it out on a future episode of the show. And so we do have a review or a comment from Spotify to read today. This comes from a June episode with Katie from the Split the Veil podcast by LSFMX. It says, "You really pranked me with this one. Zoned out for 2 seconds during the intro, and then Katie's voice came up, and I was like, wrong show. Anyway, so excited we finally got to June. So many possibilities. Heart emoji." Thank you so much for that comment. I do think June is very, very interesting. I have actually found the outside of Elgornon and Mythal some of the most interesting Evaners. So I definitely agree with all the possibilities of June. Lastly, you can join not lastly, but second to last, you can join the Discord server, Cubs Podcasting and More. You can come hang out with us, talk about Dragon Age, talk about how we're all gonna maybe put on clown makeup this summer if Dragon Age Dreadwolf is indeed happening or coming out. Maybe. I am I forgot what the phrase, we had a phrase that we came up with, not cautiously optimistic, but what was it? Cautiously open-minded. Realistic? No, cautiously open-minded.
Yeah. I think I'm more pessimistically open-minded, frankly, but sure.
Yes. But come talk share your Dragon Age woes or fan theories with us on that Discord server. And lastly, this is a new announcement, and we are so excited about this. We have launched a merch shop. So a online store that you can go and get teacups. I'm teacup. You can't buy me. I'm sorry. You can't buy me. But you can get t-shirts, you can get coffee mugs, you can get sweatshirts, hats, all kinds of stuff going on there. So a lot of awesome designs. One of Shelby's personal favorite is the Lord Seeker Lambert Hate Club. We do know that she hates that. Plus, we obviously made a t-shirt with "Swooping is Bad" on there. Grey Warden Athletic Department tees and sweatshirts and so much more. We're launching this for both podcasts, so Assassin's Creed merch is on there too. You can check that out at thecupspodcasting.com. That's it.
Abominations are always so awkward at family reunions. Have you ever seen an abomination? They are ugly.
Dorian, those words you say, what do they mean?
What, you mean like mendicant? Ultimatum?
No arse when you're mad. Pishanti Kothas. You're swearing, I know it.
Vishanta Kafas. It's Tavine, relics of the old tongue. We still use the colourful phrases.
And it means what?
Literally, you shit on my tongue.
You fear barbarians will swoop down upon you.
Yes, swooping is bad.
All right, so let's talk about the Dalish. So, we always have something to say about those pesky Dalish. But we actually have quite a bit today. So in Dalish legends, like I mentioned earlier, there is that discrepancy between whether Falon'Din and Dirthamin are twins, whether they're just like twin souls, whatever. The Dalish, they do believe they're twins. They have a couple old legends that say, oh, they were just really close friends. But despite that, almost unanimously, the Dalish believe that they are siblings and twins. And they also believe that these two are the eldest two children of Mythal and Elgranon. Now, other legends, like we've discussed, talk about the closeness of the twins, specifically that they were inseparable from birth and into their adulthood as well. In the Dirthamin Codex entry, we get a really interesting story about how they got separated. And I put this into the Dalish section because this codex entry is written by Gisharel, who tells a lot of the codex entries that have to do with elves and elven lore. So I'm going to just read this whole section and then we can discuss at the end. So this is what the codex says. One day, while passing through the forest, Falon'Din and Dirthamin came across an old and sickly deer resting beneath a tree. "Why do you sit so still, little sister?" asked Falon'Din. "Play with us," said Dirthamin. "Alas," spoke the deer, "I cannot. I am old, and although I wish to go to my rest, my legs can no longer carry me." Taking pity upon the deer, Falon'Din gathered her up into his arms and carried her to her rest beyond the vale. Dirthamin tried to follow them, but the shifting gray paths beyond the vale would not let him. End quote. The codex continues on a bit later and says this. When Dirthamin finally found Falon'Din, he found also the deer, who once again was light on her feet, for her spirit was released from her weakened body. Both Falon'Din and Dirthamin rejoiced to see this. Falon'Din vowed that he would remain to carry all the dead to their place beyond, just as he did the deer. And Dirthamin stayed with him, for the twins cannot bear to be apart. Okay, so thoughts, impressions, fanons, anything you got, hit me.
I have two things that just kind of like raise an eyebrow. I don't know if they could count them as fanons, but just raise an eyebrow. And it's the phrase of an association of a deer and then the little sister line. Because could this be representation of Gillenon? Like, I know that there are actual deer in Thedas versus Hala. Sorry. I get all this. This story reminds me a lot of like how Andriel finds Gillenon, how, like both of these stories in association with these two gods of Gillenon and Andriel they read similar. They're not the same, but they do read similar. I like the idea that like I like the story in the sense of like Falon'Din finding his purpose, and like the reason he is separated from Dirthaman is not like a falling out or a conflict between the two, but it's just that like one found their purpose and the other could not follow. Which is sad in its own way, but that's a reality that we sometimes face in our relationships and other things like that.
Especially with our siblings. But we'll get into a little bit more about Dirthaman next week. This is not the entirety of this codex. We'll read more from it next week. But the things that I think are interesting about this is, number one, agree completely the potential association with Gillenon, because we've already established she has like 3,000 creation myths for herself, right? Well, here's another one you could argue. But even more than that, I think is interesting the implication that Falon'Din is not just transporting the elves to the beyond. He's also transporting animals. So I wonder if that suggests he's transporting every dead spirit or soul, which would also include if he was alive today, but during, before the Evanurus are banished, when humans and dwarves are alive on Thedas, was he responsible for transporting them as well? I think it's an ambiguous question. I don't think we have an answer because there's no way we would have that information. But with this codex, I definitely think you can make that argument.
That's really interesting. I have more about that I want to make a comparison later, but I want to get through like all the stuff before I do, because it's related, but it'll lead to a whole different conversation.
Okay, well, let's move on because I have another thing I want to say about this codex, and then we'll pretty much be close to the end. So another thing I wanted to talk about with this codex is that I think it could potentially suggest something about Uthenera. So we know from the books that Uthenera was not applicable to all the elves because you had to be able to afford to be preserved in the eternal sleep, like I mentioned earlier. But regardless, the Dalish believe that Falon'Din visited the elders when they were in Uthenera. Dirthaman would go with him. And so these were very much journeys of enlightenment for both of them, as well as for the elders. And so then when the quickening began is when Falon'Din started carrying them to the beyond and into death. And because of the Evanurus' banishment by Fen'Harel, the Dalish do believe that Falon'Din is no longer able to guide them from the world of Thedas and into the Fade and beyond. So in order to prevent those who have died from getting lost in the afterlife, the Dalish, they bury their dead with an oak staff and a cedar branch. And they also invoke the name of Falon'Din on their deathbeds or before quests from which they expect they're not going to return. I just think this is so interesting how the Dalish have like formed their mythologies around the banishing of the Evanurus. And it's like we have almost two sets of canon here with like, yes, we have the whole Falon'Din and meeting this deer and transporting all the elves. And then they also have to come up with secondary reasons for why none of these gods are no longer around. And I just think that that's so interesting. And specifically that the Dalish, they bury their dead with the oak staff and a cedar branch so that they can find Falon'Din. And we have nothing in the lore other than just general elves being associated with nature to tell us why specifically an oak staff and a cedar branch. This might also tie back into his Valesleen, not really sure, but I just think all of that is very interesting. Do you have thoughts?
Yeah, it is interesting. It's the idea of like not being able to guide them back to where they need to rest because banishment. And I think the thing about like that Falon'Din's own act of guiding the elven souls is what started the quickening. I think that's really interesting. I know that like certain trees and other stuff have been like associated with like funeral rites in other like cultures, but I can't remember what they are. But I think cedar and oak are some of those that can be associated with death. An oak staff, like from our sense, like oak is a very sturdy wood. Like it's very like it's something that could carry you straight. Like, so I get that like symbolism there. Like you give the dead that so that they have something firm and sturdy to anchor them, to guide them. I don't know the significance of cedar, but
I know that cedar is it's used a lot in cooking. It's used because it has like a more fragrant smell than aroma than some of the other woods. It also has a really pretty color. There's lots of uses for cedar. But let's move on because I know we have some maybe theorizing to do. So I know you had something you wanted to mention with the Codex, and I also wanted to talk a little bit about Greek mythology. So I'm just kind of going to open the floor to you on whichever one of those you want to go for first.
all right. So I'm going to start with like the in-universe thing that I want to talk about that has to do with the fact that I don't want to leave this without talking about Falon'Din and the Mortalitasi.
Okay, yeah, for sure.
And just this idea of here are two places with the Navarin belief that like they have to guide the souls of the dead through the fade into spirits, like this idea of guiding these souls. And so I wonder if Falon'Din actually existed, back to your Codex thing of like maybe this idea and this stuff that comes from the Mortalitasi. And I know that they have their roots in Tevinter when they're founded. They're founded by a Tevinter mage. But perhaps that is because that, yes, Falon'Din took all the souls crossing the fade before they were banished and other things like that. But I just think the like ideology of Falon'Din guiding the souls in Dalish and the ideology that the Navarin death mages, the Mortalitasi, have about that exact thing is a really big connection that is probably related.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I know that there is conversations from Tevinter Knights and I think Inquisition, both, where Solas, he has a lot of disdain for the Mortalitasi because they actively enslave spirits to do their bidding. Like that's how they do what they do. And I'm just curious. I think this is another place that Falon'Din would agree with Solas or Fen'Harel. Another instance of them having a little bit of commonality.
Mm-hmm. So that was all that, like, I just wanted to like draw that comparison. Just because there are other than like the Dalish thing, like the Mortalitasi are the only like glimpse of burial rites that we get in Thedas outside of like the dwarfs and what they have to do. But
well, we know that other humans burn their dead. But yeah. So, okay. The other thing that we want to talk about before we get into our side character is we kind of have to bring in some Greek mythology here. And so I know Austin is kind of more of the expert on this than me, for sure, because he was so obsessed with Percy Jackson as a kid. But I think that there are two Greek gods that really come into play that have similarities with Falon'Din, and that is Charon and Hades. And I know we talked about Hades earlier. And so I am just going to let you do some comparing and contrasting between the three of them.
I think that Falon'Din isn't, to compare him to Hades is probably not where I would compare him if I was drawing a direct comparison. Chiron or Charon or Charon, it's that CH is going to make a cuss sound. But he's more like a one-for-one comparison because he is the one who ferries the souls of the dead to the afterlife. And as far as we know, there is no Evanuris that is associated with ruling over the Fade, which is like the Fade or the Veil or whatever. Like,
If there's anyone, it is Fen'Harel.
right. And we haven't talked about him, and I know that like Fen'Harel is going to be a doozy of an episode for us to get through. So just buckle up. But like Hades is the management of he's the god of the underworld and the resting place of the souls of the dead. And so it's a similar thing of like he's not really in charge of making sure you die. He's in charge of managing and overseeing the place you go when you die. And Falon'Din does not have that kind of power. He does not have that kind of influence. I think that it's really interesting, the comparison. So I would comparison more for like Chiron to get up there with like more of this fairy souls. I don't think he's a Hades character in the Pantheon.
Yeah, I think I agree. Because you're right. He's not ruling over the beyond. He's a car. Like he's transporting the souls. And so I do agree with you. I think that is distinct from the role that Hades plays. It just is. So now that we've established that, let's get into our side character today, who is one of my favorites. And I know one of your favorites. We've been looking forward to this one for a really long time. And that would be Inquisitor Ameridin, who you do get to meet in Dragon Age Inquisition, the DLC, Jaws of Hakkon. So let's just dive right in. Feel free to stop me at any time if you have questions or things to add, because this one's really interesting and really lore heavy. So, Ameridin was the last Inquisitor of the Inquisition during the Divine Age. He oversaw the creation of many systems and groups that still exist in Thedas today, but we'll get into all that in a bit. Let's dive into who Ameridin was first. So, we don't actually get a full name. All we get is Ameridin or Inquisitor Ameridin. But we do know that he was a Dalish elf. Most Thedosians believe that he was a human, but we learn in Jaws of Hakkon DLC, like I mentioned, that he was an elf. As a reminder, Ameridin lived during the Divine Age and the Ancient Age. The Divine Age is the first age, so the 100s, whereas the Ancient Age is the entire time that came before, so he lived a really long time ago. And at the same time, Emperor Cordelis Draken I is creating his Orlesian Empire, and they are friends. Now, here's something to add. I know a lot of people hate Draken. I'm not his biggest fan either, but I love Ameridin. And so I tend to give Draken a little bit, like a modicum of the benefit of the doubt, just because they were friends. And I feel like Ameridin would not have been his friend if he was like completely this horrible person. But who knows? So let's get into some of Ameridin's other relationships. So like I said, he's besties with Draken, and that's why Draken appoints Ameridin to head up the Inquisition. Talana was an elven dreamer mage and also Ameridin's lover. Heron is a Templar, part of Ameridin's party. Orina is a dwarven alchemist who's also part of their party. And then lastly, we don't have a name, but they're often frequently accompanied by a spirit who was not feared. So that was kind of the makeup of their party, excluding Emperor Draken.
Yeah, I just love the like full circle kind of like or like cyclical like pile of history that they're doing here, because Ameridin has this such diverse group following him around, and the Inquisitor and Dragon Age Inquisition is the same way. Like, which, and I know that they used to say like the human was like intended to be the only choice, but in my brain, the Inquisitor is a Lavellan. Like the Dragon Age Inquisitor is a Lavellan.
Yes, wholeheartedly, yes. With how much elven lore is just in the game, it just makes the most sense to me. It just does. Because like, and I also think when you think about how Inquisition begins, Cassandra is literally imprisoning you. And I just find it a little bit more difficult to believe that a human in good standing with a noble family would be treated the same way as a nobody Dalish elf.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
So anyway, completely agree with you on that front, but that is not the subject here. So let's get into Ameridan's organizational affiliations because he has many. So we've already discussed that he was Inquisitor, but he was especially specifically appointed by Draken because he wanted a leader that would inspire loyalty rather than fear. He also wanted a leader who could unite different groups of people. Therefore, as an elf, Ameridan was asked and said yes. So, also, because Ameridan became the leader of the Inquisition as they officially joined the Chantry, Ameridan also has a prominent role within the Chantry. He is also the leader of the Inquisition when it splits into the Templar Order and the Seekers. We're not really given much information on his opinions of these two groups, but some speculated that he vanished from the public to overshadow, so that he would not overshadow the newly formed Templar Order. We know that this isn't really true, but that was the rumor in the universe at the time. And if you take Cassandra when you do meet Ameridan, she asks him how the leader of the Seekers could be a mage. Ameridan explains that although most Inquisitors were Seekers, they did welcome the aid of mages and included them in their ranks for the purpose of hunting down demons and Maleficarum. If Cassandra has discovered the truth about the Seekers and the Right of Tranquility, Ameridan reveals that he opposed the widespread use of tranquility out of fear that it would lead to abuse, but unfortunately, his fellow compatriots promised to prevent that from happening, which we know they did not do. So, kind of a heartbreaking story. If you're an elf, you can also kind of update him about the elven plight in Thedas. He's heartbroken, obviously. And it's just a really sad conversation because there's so many things that he has no idea. I mean, he's been gone for almost 1,000 years. Like, look at Captain America in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Like, he only been gone for like 60 years, and there's so much he had to catch up on. Imagine how difficult it is for Ameridan to miss 1,000 years of history.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He did not know Andraste, though.
No, he is not old enough. Okay, so let's talk about his disappearance for a little bit. So, as we know, Ameridan is sent by Emperor Draken to the Frostback Basin on official business during the time of the Second Blight. He does this because the Frostbacks are resentful toward Orlais and Ferelden about not halting or helping with the Blight. It turns out that the Avar and the Hakkonites had summoned Hakkon in the form of a high dragon to eradicate their enemies. You know this if you've played this DLC, but Ameridan seals the dragon and himself with time magic, and they remain in stasis for a little over 800 years. This is how the Inquisitor then meets Ameridan. And like I just mentioned, there are some really interesting conversations you can have with him. If you are a Qunari Tal-Vashoth, he literally doesn't even know what you are. If you're an elf, like I just mentioned, you have the option to inform him about the fall of the Dales and Emperor Draken II's betrayal of the elves, at which he is grief-stricken. But at the end, regardless, he does succumb to the ravages of time amidst the ending of the ritual, and so he does pass away. Now, the most interesting part, maybe not the most interesting part, because this guy does so much, but one of the most interesting parts of Inquisitor Ameridan's life is his faith. And it's said in universe, it is said that he was a very pious and faithful man in the lore. But I think when this is said, it's often only interpreted as that he's an Andrastian. He believes in Andraste. But we know from the games, from this DLC, that Ameridan worshipped and honored both Andraste and the Avenurus, and that he specifically honored Gillenon above the other Avenurus. We know this because he built a shrine in the Frostback Basin dedicated to both Gillenon and Andraste. And there's actually a prayer of Ameridin at this shrine. And this is what it says. I prepare now for my final battle against this dragon of the Avar. All is in place. I offer thanks to Gillenon, Hala Mother, and to Andraste, Maker Bride. As you were raised up from mortal men to stand with our creators, our makers, so raise me up now to defend this world. Thoughts and reflections on this?
I'm really interested in the use of creators and makers in the plurals.
Me too. Me too.
Which I think is really, really interesting. Offer thanks to Gillenon, Hala Mother, and Andraste, Maker Bride, using the terms from both cultures in this. And it's interesting to me, like, our creators, our makers. I think we can interpret this as like him coming to a point of like, we have different deities, we have different gods, but we can work together, which I think is a reflection on Ameridin's life in general. Then the task that he was given with the Inquisition, with Hakkon, with everything. So I think that's probably what I don't think he's saying that like oh, these are the same. I think he's acknowledging, I think in this prayer he is giving over and acknowledging an importance of both, that both are equally important to each other, like to the people who follow that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I absolutely think he probably really does believe in both Andraste, the Maker, and the Evanuris. And I don't necessarily think there's anything in lore universe that prohibits this, other than perhaps like the priests and the priestesses of each religion saying, no, you can't worship other gods. Like, I think their lore, it actually kind of does fit together pretty well. And there's a lot of similarities between Andraste and different members of the Evanuris, specifically Mythal. And so I absolutely think both of these ideologies can coexist, and this is proof that they have coexisted. And I think also when you think about city elves over the years, of course they're going to believe in both. Of course they're going to honor the gods of their ancestors and what's right there with them, the woman who was a slave turned into a god. So I just think this kind of syncretism just makes sense in terms of the way people behave.
Right. I 100% agree with you, and it's a great point. And I would be disappointed if BioWare came out and said, "Oh, they're all just the same. Like, there's no distinction, there's no anything," because I feel like that erases the like authentic world building that they have set up in this universe. I mean, and one of the reasons we made this podcast is this game and universe paints such a realistic picture of a world with multiple religions in it. And I don't want to see that go away just by the fact of, oh, it's all the Evanuris.
Yes, I completely agree. I think it would be really disappointing to make everything elven. Just, we've talked about this 1,000 times on the podcast before. I completely agree. And I think that it also it's just not creative, in my opinion. But that is not why we're here. So let's talk about a couple trivia facts and then we'll kind of close out. So the first trivia fact I want to talk about is, even though Ameridin builds this shrine to Gillenon, he does have Dirthaman's Valasleen. Interesting. Don't know why, but he does. And then the other trivia fact I have is that while Ameridin's memories indicate that he held no distrust of the humans of Orlais, like many of his fellow elves, he did hope to return from his journey to Hakkon quickly so that he could help fight the Second Blight and rally the elves to help. He believed that unless the Dales stood with Orlais against the Darkspawn, they would lose everything that they'd gained. And he realized that the survival of Thedas really depended on every race fighting together to end this blight. And he's right, because the elves, when they don't help fight this blight, and it's the start of the Exalted March on the Dales. That's what kind of starts the intense animosity between elves and humans. Of course, there was animosity already, but it ratchets up to another level after that. And so he's right.
Well,
he's absolutely right.
And it's interesting to me because if I remember from my history, and I know that we're going to do the blights in a future episode sometime, but the
Future
second
season.
blight, the second blight is when Draken basically turns and he goes, we have to weaponize the mages. We have to utilize them. And it's because the elves don't fight with them that they don't have the forces to do so. And like the Grey Wardens, I think like this creates the treaties. The elves not fighting in the second blight is such a pinnacle moment in like Thedas history that sets up the mages being in there, which then brings up the Navarin Accords, which then brings up all of the Templar, everything that we get can be, and then the Exalted Marches on the Dales, like all of this comes back. The problems of Thedas all come back to the second blight. And it's interesting. It's just kind of tragic that Ameridan is not here to guide his people in this. It's kind of like how we talk about like how different Star Wars would be if Qui-Gon had survived the Battle of Naboo, and like how he would have been able to guide Anakin in a different way. Imagine if in this moment, Ameridan, this hero, this person who combines their command, like says to the elves, like, we have to go fight. This is our survival. Imagine like how the world would be different. And it kind of comes into like why I love Ameridan is because of this, is because he's such this charismatic and good person. And I don't say this often because there's so much gray in Thedas and Dragon Age, but he's a good person. And I think that I really, really wish this had been a main game thing. And I really wish they had set this up in a way of maybe we lost the fight at Adamant Fortress. Like maybe we prevented like them binding all the demons or whatever, but we lost bad at Adamant. Like the Grey Wardens were shattered, like all of this stuff. The Inquisitor has this huge defeat and is defeated, and it is in that time that they go and they find about Inquisitor Ameridan. I think the use of this like as an inspiration to inspire our character or our person to come and like really realize who we need to be in this state is important. Like the lessons we can learn from Ameridan as Inquisitor, even taking that all the way into Trespasser and to the Exalted Council, and all of that stuff of like collaboration of the races and all of this stuff, like so much of like who the Inquisitor needs to be is learning from who the first Inquisitor was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is a wasted opportunity that we didn't get more of Ameridan's wisdom in the game. But one thing that I would love to see is a story about Inquisitor Ameridan and his time as Inquisitor. I think this era in Dragon Age lore is perfect for a TV show. And I know we just got a TV show like a year ago, but this would make an awesome story, whether it's a TV show or a movie or a book or whatever, something live action. Like this era is perfect. Like we don't want you to canonize any of our in-game decisions. Like give us more lore about these time periods that we don't know much about. And this would be a really awesome one to tackle.
Right. And like I know like it's called the Dragon Age, so they like everything to now take place in the Dragon Age. But like it's okay if you say, oh, this is the Dragon Age, but it actually takes place in, you know, the Divine Age or whatever, which I'm pretty sure that Stolen Throne takes place in the age before dragon.
Blessed Age. Yes, it does. Yeah, it doesn't matter. Nobody cares about that. Like, give us a dragon in the story instead. But anyway, we're way off topic. We're done, unless you have anything else to talk about today.
No, I think that's all we have. Thanks for bringing this research again. These Evan Earths just keep getting more and more fascinating. I need to clear out my weekend when we record the Fen'Harel episode because we'll be here forever. But thank you all for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. We will see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. You can find us on Twitter at DALorecast.
If you have any lore questions, topics to unpack, or side character suggestions, join our Cups Podcasting and More Discord server. It's easily the best place on the internet. You can also support us financially through our Patreon. You can find us there on patreon.com/DragonAgeLorecast.
The Dragon Age Lorecast is part of the Robots Radio Network. For more information about the Robots Radio Network, join the Discord server via the link in our episode description.
If you enjoyed the show or learned something new today, please subscribe, leave us a review, and join the Patreon. And if you enjoyed our intro and outro music, give a big thank you to Pipeman Studios. Thank you, Pipeman. Thanks again for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. We'll see you next time.
Are you a fan of Elden Ring? Are you confused about the lore as pretty much everyone else? We've got you covered. Check out the Elden Archives, a lore podcast that helps to explain every little confusing detail about the lands between. Things like what exactly happened on the Night of the Black Knives, or what we really know about characters like Mythal. Just like the show you're listening to now, we're on the Robots Radio Network, so you know it'll be good. Wondering how to find the show? Easy. Either go to robotsradio.net or search Elden Archives on whatever podcatcher you're using right now. Bookmark the show for later, and we'll see you in the lands between. Again, that's The Elden Archives, a FromSoft Lorecast available everywhere.